Picture this moment. It's the morning of February 3rd, 1943, and a telegram lands on a desk in Tokyo that will shake the foundations of Japan's entire war strategy. Ambassador Oshima Hiroshi, stationed deep in Nazi Germany, has just witnessed something Berlin desperately wanted to keep hidden from the world. The German Sixth Army, more than 290,000 men strong, has been completely destroyed at Stalingrad. The day before, 91,000 skeletal, frostbitten survivors surrendered to Soviet forces in what would become Germany's first catastrophic defeat of the war. This wasn't just another battle lost. This was the moment when the myth of German invincibility shattered into pieces. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori reads the telegram once, then twice, then a third time, and the words don't change. He walks it personally to Prime Minister Tojo Hideki's office, and when he arrives, neither man can speak for several long minutes because they both understand what this means. Japan's entire strategic position, everything they've gambled on, rests on a foundation that just cracked wide open. Think about the situation they're in. Back in September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, binding themselves to Germany and Italy in an alliance built on one simple premise: Axis dominance. The plan seemed perfect at the time. Germany would crush the Soviet Union and bring Britain to its knees. Japan would secure Asia and the Pacific. Together, they'd force America to accept a completely new world order. But now, if Germany can't even defeat the Soviets, if the mighty Wehrmacht can be surrounded and utterly annihilated in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad, then what does that mean for Japan's war? What does it mean for everything they've sacrificed? Tojo's response comes quickly, and it's exactly what you'd expect from a leader trying to project strength while the ground shifts beneath his feet. 2 days later, at a press conference, he expresses Japan's profound sympathy for Germany's setback, but he insists, almost desperately, that the loss changes absolutely nothing. He declares that the Greater East Asia War and the European War are one unified struggle, that temporary reverses cannot alter the ultimate outcome, that Germany's fighting spirit remains unbroken and Japan's commitment to the Axis cause is absolute. The newspapers print his words dutifully. Radio stations broadcast them across the empire. But behind closed doors, in the private meetings of the Supreme War Council, a very different conversation is beginning to take shape. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the combined fleet, had never really believed Germany would win quickly anyway. This man studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and he understands American industrial capacity in ways that most Japanese leaders simply don't. When the Stalingrad news reaches him, he's in the middle of planning operations in the Solomon Islands, desperately trying to hold a defensive perimeter that's already crumbling around the edges. He tells his staff something chilling. Germany's defeat means the Soviets will eventually turn their full strength eastward. We are now in a race, he says quietly. Can we secure our position before the Americans overwhelm us and before the Soviets are free to act in Asia? He gives Japan 2 years at most, and tragically, in just 4 months, he'll be dead. His plane shot down over Bougainville by American fighters who managed to decrypt his travel schedule. The army leadership, though, they see Stalingrad through completely different eyes. General Sugiyama Hajime, chief of the Army General Staff, argues that Germany's setback is tactical, not strategic. He points out that the Wehrmacht still holds vast territories inside the Soviet Union, that German industry still outproduces Soviet factories, though his intelligence is actually years out of date and he doesn't even know it. The Army's position is brutally simple. Japan has committed to war against America, Britain, and the Netherlands, and retreat is impossible. Honor demands they fight to either victory or complete annihilation. If Germany is weakening, then Japan must fight even harder to compensate. The idea that the Axis might actually lose this war, that thought isn't even speakable yet in Army headquarters. But over in the Navy Ministry, doubts are growing like cracks in ice. Admiral Yonai Mitsamesa, who'll later become Navy Minister, starts keeping a private diary in the spring of 1943, and his entries, discovered only after the war ends, reveal a man watching his entire nation march straight toward catastrophe. "The German reversal troubles me greatly," he writes in March. "If they cannot defeat Russia after 2 years of trying, with all their superior equipment and training, what hope do we have against America's infinite resources? Yet I cannot speak these thoughts aloud. To question victory is to invite accusations of defeatism, or worse." The intelligence reports keep flowing in from Berlin, and Ambassador Oshima, a true believer in German victory, tries his best to present each new development in the most positive light possible. When the Africa Corps surrenders in Tunisia in May, he reports that this actually frees up German forces for the Eastern Front. When the Allies invade Sicily in July, he emphasizes German defensive preparations. But the underlying trend is absolutely undeniable to anyone reading between the lines. Germany is losing ground, losing men, losing the initiative, and Japanese intelligence officers who really study Oshima's dispatches understand what he refuses to say. The Wehrmacht is being ground down in a war of attrition it simply cannot win. Then comes September 1943, and the collapse of Italy forces a real reckoning. Mussolini gets arrested by his own government, rescued by German commandos in a dramatic raid, and installed as a puppet ruler in northern Italy, but the Italian military has effectively left the war. Just like that, one of the three Axis powers is gone. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council meets in emergency session, and for the first time, the possibility of defeat is actually discussed openly, though interestingly, the word defeat itself is never actually used. The question on the table is whether Japan should seek a separate peace with China or maybe the Soviet Union, anything to free up resources for the Pacific War. The debate splits along predictable lines. The Army insists that any peace overture will be seen as weakness and will only encourage the Allies to demand unconditional surrender. Better to keep fighting, demonstrate Japan's resolve, and eventually negotiate from a position of strength. The Navy, much more aware of the shipping losses and fuel shortages that are slowly strangling Japan's war effort, argues for at least exploring diplomatic options while Japan still controls significant territories. But no consensus emerges from the meeting. They end up deciding to just continue the current strategy while monitoring developments in Europe, which is really just a fancy way of saying they're paralyzed and don't know what to do. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru, who took office back in April 1943, understands that monitoring isn't actually a strategy at all. He begins making tentative, unofficial contacts with Soviet diplomats, carefully trying to gauge whether Moscow might be willing to mediate some kind of peace between Japan and the Western Allies. The Soviets, bound by their neutrality pact with Japan but already secretly planning their eventual entry into the Pacific War, give noncommittal responses. They're just waiting, watching to see exactly how far Germany will fall before they make their move. Meanwhile, in Berlin, The situation deteriorates rapidly through the winter of 1943 and into 1944. The Soviets liberate Kiev in November. Leningrad's brutal siege is finally broken in January. By spring, the Red Army is approaching Poland's borders. Ambassador Oshima's reports grow increasingly strained and desperate. He describes tactical withdrawals and strategic repositioning, fancy terms for retreat. He emphasizes new German weapons still in development, jet aircraft and rockets that will supposedly turn the tide of the war. He quotes German officials who promise that the Anglo-American alliance will eventually fracture, that Britain and America will realize the Soviet Union is their true enemy and make common cause with Germany against Bolshevism. Some people in Tokyo want desperately to believe these assurances because the alternative is just too grim to contemplate. But the numbers, the cold hard numbers, tell a completely different story. Japanese intelligence estimates German casualties on the Eastern Front at over 3 million by early 1944. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies back in 1940, is being systematically destroyed by relentless American daylight bombing and British night raids. German industrial production is actually holding up remarkably well, but raw materials are becoming increasingly scarce, and the Romanian oil fields that supply much of Germany's fuel are now under serious threat from both Soviet advances and American bombers. Then comes June 6, 1944, D-Day, and any remaining illusions are completely eliminated. Germany now faces the full crushing weight of American and British forces pouring in from the West, while the Soviets continue their relentless grind forward from the East. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council meets again, and this time the discussion is brutally blunt. Navy Minister Yonai states flatly, without any sugarcoating, that Germany will lose the European war within a year. The only real questions now are how long they can hold out, and whether their continued resistance will buy Japan enough time to negotiate acceptable peace terms. Prime Minister Tojo, whose political position has been steadily eroding for months due to continuous military setbacks in the Pacific, tries desperately to maintain the hard line. Germany's situation is difficult, he concedes carefully, but not hopeless. They still retain significant industrial capacity and millions of men under arms. More importantly, our fate is not tied to Germany's fate. We fight for our own survival and for the liberation of Asia from Western colonialism. Whether Germany wins or loses, Japan must continue the struggle. But Tojo's support is crumbling beneath him like sand. The fall of Saipan in July, bringing American B-29 bombers within direct range of the Japanese home islands, becomes the final blow to his authority. He resigns on July 18th and gets replaced by General Koiso Kuniakai, who honestly has no clearer strategy but at least represents a change from the policies that led to this disaster. The new government's very first priority is conducting a brutally honest assessment of Japan's true strategic position, and what they discover is absolutely devastating. Japan's merchant fleet, which numbered over 6 million tons at the war's start, has been reduced to less than 2 million tons, and it's sinking fast under relentless submarine attacks. American submarines are systematically strangling the supply lines to the southern territories. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies, which was literally the entire reason Japan went to war in the first place, are now down to barely a trickle. The combined fleet, which had terrorized the Pacific back in 1942, is now a shadow force desperately short of both fuel and trained pilots. And now Germany, Their powerful ally who was supposed to tie down American and British resources in Europe is clearly, obviously, undeniably losing. The question of what to do about Germany's impending collapse divides Japanese leadership into three distinct factions. The peace faction, centered around Navy Minister Yonai and certain members of the Foreign Ministry, argues that Germany's defeat makes Japan's position completely hopeless and they should seek peace immediately while they still hold at least some territories to bargain with. The moderates, including new Prime Minister Koiso, believe Japan should continue fighting but simultaneously explore diplomatic channels, possibly through Soviet mediation. The diehards, concentrated heavily in the army and among younger officers, insist that surrender is absolutely unthinkable under any circumstances. Japan must fight to the very end, inflicting such horrific casualties on any invaders that the Allies will eventually be forced to agree to a negotiated peace that at least preserves the imperial system. Through the fall and winter of 1944, these three factions maneuver and argue while the military situation grows progressively worse. In Europe, the Soviets sweep through Poland and crash into the Balkans. The Western Allies liberate France and push hard toward Germany's borders. Ambassador Oshima's dispatches from Berlin take on an almost desperate quality now. He reports that Germany is mobilizing every single available man, that miraculous new weapons will soon appear on the battlefield, that the German people's will to resist remains absolutely unbroken. But he also reports, in thinly coded language that fools absolutely no one, that Berlin is preparing for a siege, that government functions are being frantically moved to underground bunkers, that officials are burning documents by the truckload. The fall of Manila in February 1945 brings the war crashing right to Japan's doorstep. American forces are now clearly poised to invade Okinawa, the absolute last stepping stone before they reach the home islands themselves. And in Europe, the end is painfully, obviously near. Soviet forces cross the Oder River, approaching Berlin from the east like an unstoppable tide. American and British armies cross the Rhine, advancing steadily from the west. Germany is being crushed between two absolutely massive armies, caught in a vice. And this is exactly what Japan fears will happen to them, crushed between American forces advancing relentlessly from the Pacific and Soviet forces that will inevitably enter the war the moment Germany finally falls. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt suddenly dies, and some people in Tokyo allow themselves a brief moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, this might change American war aims, that Roosevelt's successor might prove more willing to negotiate some kind of reasonable settlement. But President Truman makes it crystal clear almost immediately that he will continue Roosevelt's uncompromising policy of unconditional surrender. There will be no compromise, no face-saving peace, no negotiated settlement. Japan will surrender completely and utterly, or it will be destroyed. Period. The news from Berlin grows increasingly sporadic as April drags on. Ambassador Oshima's last substantive dispatch comes on April 20th, Hitler's birthday of all days. He describes a brief, grim ceremony held in the Führer's bunker, attended by haggard officials who all know the end is literally only days away now. Oshima himself will soon flee Berlin as Soviet artillery begins systematically shelling the city center. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his underground bunker. On May 7th, Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allied forces. The war in Europe is over. The Japanese government receives official confirmation of Germany's surrender on May 8th, and Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, who has returned to office under the new government of Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, immediately calls an emergency cabinet meeting. For 3 solid hours, the ministers debate intensely what Germany's complete defeat actually means for Japan's future. The peace faction argues passionately that continuing this war is now utterly pointless. Japan stands completely alone against the combined might of America, Britain, and very soon the Soviet Union as well. Every single day of continued fighting brings only more death, more destruction, more suffering. The time to seek peace is right now, this moment, while Japan still has at least some bargaining position left. The army representatives reject this argument completely and absolutely. General Anami Korechika, the war minister, states firmly that Germany's surrender changes nothing whatsoever about Japan's sacred obligations. "We did not fight for Germany," he says with conviction. "We fought for Japan, for Asia, for the Emperor. Those causes remain unchanged. The Americans demand unconditional surrender, which means the complete end of everything we hold sacred. We will not accept such terms. We must fight on and make them pay such a horrific price for any invasion that they will be forced to agree to terms that preserve the imperial system and Japan's honor." Prime Minister Suzuki, a retired admiral who survived an assassination attempt during the February 26th incident 9 years earlier, tries desperately to find some kind of middle ground. He acknowledges that Germany's defeat is deeply regrettable, but he insists that Japan's situation is fundamentally different. Japan is fighting a defensive war, protecting its home islands and its emperor. The Japanese people's spirit is stronger than Germany's ever was. Their willingness to sacrifice is greater. He proposes continuing the war while simultaneously exploring diplomatic options through whatever neutral parties still exist. But what neutral parties actually remain at this point? Switzerland and Sweden have no real leverage with the Allies whatsoever. The Vatican has zero influence on American policy. That leaves only the Soviet Union, which has carefully maintained its neutrality pact with Japan even while it was busy crushing Germany into dust. Foreign Minister Togo receives authorization to approach Soviet Ambassador Yakov Malik with a proposal. Japan will offer significant concessions in Manchuria and possibly other territories. If the Soviet Union will agree to mediate a peace settlement that preserves the imperial system and avoids direct occupation. The Soviets, who have already secretly agreed at the Yalta Conference to enter the war against Japan within exactly 3 months of Germany's defeat, give polite but carefully non-committal responses. They're simply waiting for precisely the right moment to strike, when they can seize maximum territory with minimum cost and casualties. Japan's desperate diplomatic overtures are useful only in that they clearly suggest Japanese desperation, which means Soviet entry into the war will likely face even less resistance than they expected. Through June and July of 1945, the Japanese government remains completely paralyzed by these deep internal divisions. The peace faction keeps pointing to the systematic devastation of Japanese cities by relentless American bombing, the mass starvation spreading rapidly through the civilian population as food supplies dwindle to almost nothing, the complete and total collapse of the merchant marine. The army faction counters by pointing to the 60 million Japanese subjects who could theoretically be mobilized for homeland defense, the thousands of aircraft being carefully held in reserve specifically for kamikaze attacks on invasion fleets, the mountain caves being prepared as fortresses for a final desperate stand. Both sides invoke the emperor's welfare and the nation's sacred honor, but they mean completely different things by those powerful words. Emperor Hirohito himself remains officially silent, as constitutional tradition absolutely demands, but in private audiences with his most senior advisors, he makes his views increasingly, unmistakably clear. He has personally read the detailed reports from Germany describing the utter, complete devastation of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and other major cities. He understands perfectly well that Japan faces similar total destruction if this war continues much longer. He has also carefully read intelligence assessments suggesting that the Soviet Union will enter the war very soon, which will make Japan's position completely and utterly hopeless. He wants peace desperately, but he cannot say so publicly, cannot give that order directly, without triggering an almost certain military coup by army officers who consider any surrender to be treasonous betrayal. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th, with a single bomb that destroys an entire city in one blinding flash, forces this issue violently into the open. The Supreme War Council meets in yet another emergency session. For the very first time in this entire war, the emperor speaks directly, explicitly asking his advisors to seriously consider accepting the Potsdam Declaration's terms for surrender. But even this extraordinary imperial intervention is not enough to break the deadlock. The peace faction argues desperately that the atomic bomb makes any continued resistance utterly suicidal. The army faction argues back that the Americans probably have only one such bomb, maybe two at most, and that Japan must continue fighting regardless of the cost. Then on August 9th, two more catastrophes strike simultaneously, like hammer blows. A second atomic bomb destroys Nagasaki in another blinding flash. And the Soviet Union, having waited exactly 3 months since Germany's surrender, just as they promised at Yalta, declares war on Japan and invades Manchuria with absolutely overwhelming force. Over 1 million Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed through Japanese defenses that have been severely weakened by constant transfers of units to the Pacific. The Guandong Army, once considered the absolute pride of Japanese military might, collapses within mere days. The Supreme War Council meets again on the night of August 9th, and the session extends into the early morning hours of August 10th. The debate is bitter, fierce, almost violent in its intensity. Even now, even with 2 cities literally vaporized by atomic weapons and a massive Soviet invasion already underway and succeeding, the army faction still argues for continuing the fight. They propose abandoning Manchuria and Korea entirely, withdrawing all remaining forces back to the home islands, and preparing for one final apocalyptic battle that will cost the invaders so dearly in blood that they will simply have to negotiate some kind of settlement. The peace faction argues back that this is complete madness, that millions more Japanese will die for absolutely nothing, that the emperor himself and the nation's very existence will be utterly destroyed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, with the council deadlocked 3 votes to 3, Prime Minister Suzuki takes an absolutely unprecedented, almost unthinkable step. He directly asks the emperor to break the tie, to make this decision himself. Emperor Hirohito, speaking slowly and with perfect clarity, says that he cannot bear to see his people suffer any longer. Japan will accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender, with just one single condition, that the imperial institution itself be preserved. It is the first time in all of modern Japanese history that an emperor has made such a direct, explicit decision on national policy. Even then, even after the emperor himself has spoken, the struggle is still not over. Army officers, learning of this decision, attempt a desperate military coup to prevent the surrender announcement from ever being broadcast. They seize the imperial palace, frantically searching everywhere for the recording of the emperor's surrender speech. They fail to find it, hidden away safely, and senior officers still loyal to the emperor manage to suppress the coup attempt by dawn. On August 15th at exactly noon, the emperor's voice is broadcast over radio for the very first time in Japanese history, announcing Japan's surrender directly to the Japanese people. In his carefully crafted speech, written specifically to avoid using the actual word surrender, Hirohito cites several reasons for this painful decision. He mentions a new and most cruel bomb that threatens the complete extinction of human civilization itself. He mentions the Soviet Union's entry into the war. But he also says something particularly revealing, something that shows how much Germany's defeat had weighed constantly on Japanese strategic thinking. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. The general trends of the world. It was as close as the emperor would ever come to publicly acknowledging what Japanese leaders had understood ever since Stalingrad, had feared deeply since Italy's surrender, and had finally been forced to accept after Germany's complete collapse. That Japan had bet absolutely everything on an Axis victory that was simply never going to happen. Germany's defeat had not directly caused Japan's surrender in any simple, linear way. The atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion were clearly the immediate triggers, the final straws. But Germany's long, grinding, inexorable collapse from the frozen hell of Stalingrad all the way to the burning ruins of Berlin had fundamentally shaped every single strategic decision Japan made from 1943 onward, like a dark shadow growing longer and longer across their planning. In the weeks immediately after the surrender, as American occupation forces begin arriving and the Japanese government starts the deeply humiliating process of complete disarmament, some of these intense internal debates finally become public. Admiral Yonai, the Navy minister who had doubted victory for so long, gives a remarkably frank interview to a Japanese newspaper. From the moment Germany could not defeat the Soviet Union, he says with quiet certainty, our war became unwinnable. We continued fighting for 2 more terrible years, not because we believed we could actually win, but because we simply could not agree on acceptable terms for losing. That disagreement, that paralysis, cost hundreds of thousands of precious lives. General Yamamoto, the war minister who had argued so passionately for fighting to the absolute end, commits ritual suicide on the morning of August 15th, just hours after the emperor's broadcast reaches the nation. He leaves behind a note that reads simply, heartbreakingly, I apologize with my death for my great crime. Whether that crime was leading Japan into a hopeless war or accepting surrender before fighting to complete extinction, he does not specify, and we will never know. Ambassador Oshima, who spent years in Berlin absolutely convinced that Germany would ultimately prevail, is arrested by American forces and later tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. His testimony there reveals the shocking depth of his fundamental miscalculation. He had believed until almost the very end, until Berlin itself was burning, that German technology and German fighting spirit would somehow overcome Soviet numbers, and American industrial might. He had consistently reported what he desperately wanted to believe rather than what he actually observed with his own eyes. His optimistic dispatches had helped sustain dangerous Japanese illusions about Axis prospects long after those prospects had completely vanished. The final accounting is absolutely grim when you add it all up. Japan had entered this war with Germany as its powerful ally, genuinely believing that together they could reshape the entire world order. They had watched Germany march triumphantly from victory to victory in 1940 and 1941 and had convinced themselves utterly that the Axis powers were invincible, unstoppable. But Germany's catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had cracked that fundamental certainty. Italy's sudden surrender had deepened the doubt considerably. D-Day had made the final outcome unmistakably clear to anyone willing to see it. And Germany's total collapse had left Japan facing alone, completely alone, the same combined forces that had systematically crushed the mighty Wehrmacht into dust. What the Japanese High Command actually said when they learned Germany was losing varied tremendously by person and by time. Some leaders, like Admiral Yonai, had suspected the truth from the very beginning and grew only more certain with each successive German setback. Others, like Prime Minister Tojo, had insisted on maintaining public optimism even as the evidence mounted higher and higher against them. Still others, like General Yamamoto, had argued with genuine conviction that Germany's fate was ultimately irrelevant to Japan's sacred duty and honor. But beneath all the carefully crafted public statements and the intense private debates, there was this growing, terrible understanding that the tripartite pact had bound Japan irrevocably to a losing cause, and that extricating themselves from that cause without admitting defeat was simply impossible within the framework of their military culture and political system. In the end, what they said mattered far less than what they actually did. They continued fighting desperately, furiously, long after Germany's defeat had become absolutely inevitable to any objective observer. Unable to reach agreement on how to end a war they increasingly knew in their hearts they could not win. The true cost of that paralysis, that inability to accept reality, was measured in cities destroyed by fire and atomic weapons, in populations starved by blockade, in hundreds of thousands of lives lost unnecessarily in the final brutal months of a war whose ultimate outcome had already been determined on the frozen steppes outside Stalingrad, on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, and in the smoking ruins of Berlin. Japan's leaders had watched Germany fall in slow motion, had understood with growing clarity what it meant for their own survival, and yet they marched forward anyway, deeper and deeper into the abyss, until atomic fire and Soviet steel finally forced them to face the truth they had been avoiding for more than 2 years.